so much for your attention. So this talk is really, as it says on the title, it's a retrospective on my time spent in Italy much of this past year, mainly at the American Academy in Rome, as a home base from September through June. And I learned so much from this experience, and I gained a lot of momentum with my research and my writing. And I simply wanted to share some of the wealth of insights that I've come across and try to draw together some threads of experience and research here in this space with all of you, so that I can kind of figure out what the future directions are and, receive some insights and feedback from you on what's interesting, and present some of what I found were the main themes that I encountered in the kind of realms of depth psychology and myth. Now, not everyone here, many of you are depth psychologists and mythologists, but not everyone is. So I thought I would just start with a couple of slides referring to what is a myth. But before I do that, I will just explain a little bit the symbol of this image that you're seeing, because that in a way represents where we're going in this talk. The types of myths that sort of live in Italy and have inspired my own studies of Greek and Latin language and literature from when I was very small. So in this land, it's like I found that there are many places to go deeply, to look under the surface, because there's many layers of civilization in Italy. There are many places, especially to go down, sometimes even underground, and to find these origins of some of the myths that we talk about in popular culture with reference to texts we read. And here in the Grotte di Castellana in Puglia, in the south of Italy, these are 90 to 100 million years old. These caves were formed underwater when this area was still underwater. And so it's like when you enter these caves, there's 3 kilometers of them that you can traverse. And you start to see images, you start to see these connections between things like the stalactites and the stalagmites that grow together, and they form columns eventually, because it takes them so long to do that. But there's these connections that are drawn, there's these images that form, and it's a very empowering experience. And you can't really get much older than that, right? 90 to 100 million years ago, to inspire some of the underworld mythologies that I'll be discussing in this talk. So for those of us who don't study myth regularly, what do I mean when I say myth? Well, it means so many things. It comes from the Greek word mythos. It's a word, it's an utterance, it's a story, it's a saying or a proverb. It can be a purpose or intention, a rumor, public speech, a plot of a story. It can be a vocabulary. It can be a reference to a bigger story that's encased in another story. So you have that kind of, almost reference point for something beyond, some story beyond the present story. It's an expression of identity. It's also a story archetype that has many variants that sometimes crop up in very disparate places, but it all points to this phenomenon that I call aletheia, which is the Greek word for truth. And it's a truth that does not get given over to the river Leth, or Leith. It's not given over to the underworld river, the river of forgetfulness. So a myth is something that requires living memory to sustain it. It's immortal because it's forever preserved in mortal memories. And so that's what our responsibility is as mythologists and as storytellers, is to help these myths to survive and to deliver their truth, their aletheia, to all of us. And what is depth psychology? Well, there's many definitions of what depth psychology is for those of you who are not familiar with it, but one that I've come across quite recently that was very powerful and resonant for me was my colleague Dylan Francisco's commencement invocation at Pacifica this past May, where he says, depth is a guiding metaphor for our view that humans are more than they appear, and this more is below the surface, like a submerged iceberg, like a tree with extensive invisible roots, or like a cave, potentially. The origins and sources of human motivation, behavior, and experience are rooted in a depth that exceeds what we are aware of. This, of course, doesn't mean that we are not interested in what is outwardly observable, only that we read what we observe differently, as more than the manifestation of what people think that they are doing and saying. So there's this sort of underlying groundwater motivation, and a lot of that might be kind of illuminated when we talk about myths and archetypes and these story explanations for human behavior. So that's what one definition for what we talk about when we talk about depth psychology. So let's go underneath the surface in Italy together in places that at least I've been. There are innumerable places, but I'll introduce you to some that have inspired me. Just before we do that, I'll just acknowledge the importance of Greco-Roman myth to the Western tradition of depth psychology. There are other depth psychologies out there, but for the kind of Western, Germanic, Jungian-oriented piece, this tradition has been very important, and I'm just giving you some bibliography of sources that are devoted to Greek and Roman myth being a kind of map or model for the human psyche. And it almost creates this kind of overlay of a kind of psychological reality that is visible when we study it alongside our perceptual reality, much like this painting that I'm just going to see if I can zoom in on. We didn't test this, sorry. Of Gustave Moreau's The Muses leaving their father Apollo to go and enlighten the world. I saw this painting in Paris very recently, and it has these characters that you can kind of see them stenciled in the corners of this painting. And it's like they exist alongside the anthropomorphic characters. There's a little griffin over here by one of these muses. And indeed, the muses and Apollo himself, they are covered with this kind of stenciling. So it's almost like this understanding of they're wearing more than their garb. And that's another thing we can acknowledge is perceptual and depth psychology, and myth is like we're living these archetypal moments as well as our daily life. So in the stages of this talk, I have 3 main phases I'll take us through, and then we'll move to Q&A. So I'll talk about Rome, which is what I'm most familiar with, the area, the city, which I found to be a home of layers and thresholds, and I'll explain how that works in the course of the talk. I'll go from there to talking about places of catabasis and anabasis, or places of a going down and a coming up, because that's one of the most prominent sort of symbols in the myths that I study from this area are the going into the underworld and coming up. And there's plenty of places we can all visit if we can get over there, or visit in our imaginations that involve a going down and a coming up. And finally, I'll talk about some of my current research and research journeys and synchronicities, some kind of place-based interests that I found in Zurich when I went to visit the Jung House and Museum and did some archival research there, and in Ravenna in northern Italy. So we're traveling from Rome up to Zurich and down to Ravenna, and we've already been to Puglia in our very opening slide. So when we talk about Rome, it's already been theorized as a place of psyche, or maybe not theorized as a place of psyche, by Sigmund Freud, when he asks us all to imagine Rome, the city of Rome, as psyche. But he's saying that the psyche is capable of kind of accessing its lived experience at every stage. And so that would be the same as having a Rome that has all of its stages of civilization visible at one time, essentially. By a flight of imagination, we can see that Rome is not a human habitation, but a psychical entity with a similarly long and copious past. An entity, that is to say, in which nothing that has once come into existence will have passed away. So everything continues to exist, all the phases of development. And then he says, well, there's clearly no thought in spinning our fantasy any further, for it leads to things that are unimaginable and even absurd. If we want to represent historical sequence in spatial terms, we can only do it by juxtaposition in space. The same space cannot have 2 different contents. Well, I'm going to challenge Freud in this paper and claim that it can. The same space can have 2 different contents, or more than 2. Yes, more than 2. And also, it's kind of an interesting exercise in theorizing Rome and almost trying to control its topography and its imagery. Like Freud would have it that the whole city is at every stage visible at once. Mussolini would have it that he redefines these old Roman ruins like the Colosseum as examples of Roman and Italian power and during the height of fascism. So when he was constructing his EUR, or the Esposizione Universale Roma, in 1943, it never really made it into the World's Fair in the early 40s that it was intended for because of the World War. But this project was completed, and it was meant to kind of showcase this Italian might that also resonates with the Colosseum. But why do we need two Colosseums is a good question, So that was his attempt. And then we have this modern attempt to kind of reconstruct Rome in its layers through the intervention of the Museo della Forma Urbis. The Forma Urbis was a big marble map that was made in the 3rd century CE. Now it fell apart. It was taken apart and used as building materials, and some of it is probably still holding up Roman ruins every once in a while. And there's an attempt to piece it back together and find the structure of it. And with the help of the Noli map here, the La Pianta Grande di Roma by Giovanni Battista Noli in the 18th century. So in this museum, the Noli map is overlain by the pieces of the old Roman map that we have. So there's this attempt at reconstructing and recomposing these layers of this city. Now, what these attempts don't really show is the complexity of the layers and heights and depths of Rome. This is the Forum. And so we have, not everything coexisting as Freud would have imagined it, but we do have a lot coexisting together from different periods. And that makes things very interesting and inspiring to kind of map onto psychologically and in terms of relationship with the land and seeing what sort of gods and goddesses have inhabited this area and have given their imprint onto the land in certain ways. And even the poets, the ancient poets, offered this kind of practice and tried to draw significance through the mythology that went with certain places. This is a map of Rome in the early Augustan period, at the beginning of the imperial period, and 1st century BCE, 1st century CE. And the Roman poet Ovid during that time, he's quite a critic of the emperor. He ends up getting exiled for writing a poem about how to find hookup spots in the city of Rome. And these are quite illicit places. It's places to have affairs and adulteries and for Roman citizens to commune with and, find these assignation points with foreigners, like all the things that Augustus said are wrong. So there's some hearts that I've added that show places where Ovid says, yeah, here's your person. So let's look at the kind of Forma Urbis, how that lines up. So we have the portico scattered with old frescoes that takes its name from Livia, Augustus's wife. That's like the first place that Ovid tells us to go. He says, right in this portico where Augustus named after his wife, yeah, find someone who you're not married to, who might be married, even better, and get her. So then we have the Portico Livii is actually part of the map that survives, the Forma Urbis. We also have the Basilica, the Forum. Who'd believe it? That's also suitable for love. We see the Basilica Julia there. That's right in the center of the Roman Forum. And Ovid also names that as a place where the lawyer who is supposed to be handling legal cases actually has to deal with his own case and plead his own case as being a lover. And he's in some trouble in that respect. And so think poetic is what Ovid would say. This is a modern graffito from Trastevere, which is my neighborhood, our former neighborhood. at the edge of the map over here. And that's another place where Ovid says you can find some lovers at the Naumachii, which were these big festivals with naval battles, mock naval battles. So you imagine like a big oval, and Augustus would fill it with water, have it filled with water, and there would be these big naval reconstructions of ancient naval battles. And that was a place where you can really sit very close to the lady that strikes your fancy. So what else is there? I mean, if that's our reference point, it was also kind of a hinterland in the city. It wasn't incorporated until the Augustan period as part of the city. So it was inhabited by a lot of artisans and people coming from the port of Ostia, foreigners, and people were kind of more marginal in Roman society. And there were a lot of Etruscans who would come over the hills and raid the area. So it was a very vulnerable space. But today, this area of the just across the river and up on the hill, the Gianicolo, is the home of the American Academy in Rome, where we spent our year. It was founded in 1894, first as a school of architecture, and then they opened it up to artists and scholars in residence from September to June, and some shorter stints in between. So if anyone's interested, if anyone's an artist or a humanities person, please look into applying for a visiting scholarship, visiting artist. I haven't been told to say this, but it's really a beautiful community. And their mythic mascot is Janus, and he's over here at the top of this kind of archway leading into the academy. And he has a long history in this area, as our friend Ovid tells us in his Fasti, which was a calendrical poem that emerged around the same time as the Ars Amatoria, the love poem that I described earlier. He is speaking in Janus's voice. He says in Janus's voice, "I settled the ground whose left side the softest wave of the sandy Tiber, the river, grazes. Here, where Rome is now, the uncompromised wood used to flourish, and all of this was pasture for a few cattle. My citadel was the hill which this age calls the Gianicolum. Now it's called the Gianicolo. Calls it by my name. I ruled then when the earth found the gods bearable and divine powers were mixed with human affairs." So this is when the gods and humans lived together in harmony. And Janus is often, so he's kind of conflating this idea of a golden age with his influence in that area. And he also claims his age, his antiquity, this god. He says, "The ancients used to call me Chaos. Yes, I am that old." Now, as the small signifiers of my once confused form, because he was kind of this mass of undifferentiated matter as chaos, I have the same face in front and behind. So his sort of two-faced appearance is a remnant of that origin. Whatever and wherever you look, sky, earth, clouds, land, everything is closed and opened by my hand. So it is a site of thresholds, right? And site of archways. And so during my time in Rome, I became very interested in archways. And this is the restoration of a statue that's in the middle of the Cortile in the Academy. And it's an interesting statue because it has this baby Heracles with snakes, battling these snakes that were sent by Hera to destroy him in his infancy, and he did not succeed. And so we have this beautiful archway here. There's another archway in the Villa Borghese. So I just kind of wanted to show you some of the motifs of arches that you can find, both man-made and natural. Some of these stone pines in the Villa Doria Pamphili, which was a public park very close to the Academy, they almost look like arches. And sometimes you have these arches with human figures that are fragmented, like this one on the left is an actor with a mask but no face. And that really interested me. It's like, what is the invitation there to enter through this doorway? And your host doesn't have a head, but they do, but it's a mask. And the other side, we have this kind of Venus figure that was very familiar to me walking through the Villa Doria Pamphili. It's a very old kind of elite estate, and she's got a body, a lower half, but no upper half, and she's in this grotto. So you have this kind of enchantment and this interest in maybe completing some of these forms or maybe engaging them in their fragmented form. I mean, this is really one of the riddles of Rome. And it's also this place, if we think about archways, if we think about beginnings and endings, openings and closings, there's a motif of death and rebirth, life and death, that also is very apparent in that part of the city, which was not far from a necropolis. It was not far from a burial ground in antiquity. And we see, in the academy, we have these walls that are covered with these kinds of burial motifs and these inscriptions, and they're all funerary. And so it's important to just, whenever you're there, even just having dinner outside, it's like we're surrounded by these stories of people who want to remember their loved ones and their relationships, even in as short a form as something like this, to the departed spirits, dis manibus, I commit Cellius Valentinus, well-deserving husband, with whom Sartoria Calliste lived 10 years without a problem or without quarrel, without issue. So that's, there's so many. There's children who are mourning their parents, parents who are mourning their children, and some forms of people who are kind of in a sort of without heads but embracing. So it can be very striking to meet some of these characters. And even life and death is a motif in other parts of the academy, like the garden that I worked in every week, most weeks from February onwards that I was there, just harvesting, planting and harvesting, planting and harvesting. We were always had like a flower or a bed that we harvested the crops, and then we would just get it ready and plant something new there. And so that taught me a lot about just letting go and trusting in the process of natural cycles of death and rebirth, death and rebirth. So moving from there, from this place of openings and closing, this Janus realm, I wanted to take us into a couple of examples of places of catabasis and anabasis, or this kind of going down into the underworld and re-emerging. So I guess that's kind of related to the motif of Janus in its own way. And this is indeed, a place, a land of stories, major epics that have this motif of death and rebirth. It's the land of Dante, whose tomb I visited at Ravenna, and you can see his image in the back there. And this lamp, this oil lamp, now the Florentines apparently want his tomb to be moved there, but the Ravenna will not let them have it, because Florence exiled him to Ravenna for the last part of his life. And so now the Florence apparently gives the oil through which the lamp is lit. So they're still a part of this commemoration of Dante in Ravenna, the place where he died. And we also have another author, Apuleius, who wrote The Golden Ass, or the Metamorphoses that some might be aware of. That has a big underworld scene where Psyche goes to the underworld while she's trying to find her beloved Cupid, and she has to go and pay a visit to Persephone. And so his house is actually purported to be in Ostia, which is that port city by Rome that I got to visit. So this is a land of authors, this is a land of stories that involve big, deep dives into the underworld for guidance, for protection, for prophecy, and those are all always dangerous journeys. Now, for us, there are a couple of places that I wanted to share with you that made a big impression on me that have this kind of imaginary of going down and coming up. And the first is the Basilica di San Clemente, which has, contrary to what Freud is talking about, 3 levels. Yes, they're not all in the state in which they were when they were originally built, but they coexist in very powerful ways. And so the first is, and this is really it's a church by the Colosseum. It's very close to the Colosseum. Level 1 is a 12th century basilica, and this is Giancarlo modeling the scale of like how tall and immense this is. And so you can see these mosaics, these beautiful mosaics, are quite beatific. They have a lot of floral imagery. They have a lot of animals, and it's very, very elaborate. And there's sort of saints along the walls, and the floors have this lovely marble that comes from these big Roman columns, and they kind of chiseled little pieces of it and put them together into these mosaics. That was very popular in the 12th century. So some of the floors have like these round, almost mandala-like look, and there's unfortunately not in this image, but a little bit further to the right, they would be. So there's a 12th century basilica, and then there's a descent. So you go down these stairs and you enter this 4th to 11th century basilica. There's different levels, there's different kind of coexisting motifs that come from centuries within that spectrum. But you can see it's like still a very open space, even though it's underground, and it's filled with frescoes that commemorate the lives of, or the life of San Clemente, who is the patron saint of this basilica. And he is known for his martyrdom. So he was thrown into the sea, anchored down and thrown into the sea. And then his tomb was known for its kind of miraculous coming forth from the tide. So the tide would recede and his tomb would be revealed at certain times. And there was a boy who was lost at sea, and his mother, gave him up for dead. But apparently, a year later, he miraculously turned up with the tide on the tomb when the tide went out. So this is him being restored to his mother's care in one of these frescoes. And there's also, there's interesting other things down there. There's a sarcophagus, there's a Roman sarcophagus that has the story of Phaedra and Hippolytus. Phaedra trying to find a way to connect amorously with her stepson Hippolytus, and him running away from her. Now, I'm not sure why someone would choose that for their sarcophagus, or someone would choose that for their family member. Well, maybe there's a story there, a little too resonant. But there's that, there's a lot of different places to visit down on the second level that make it into a different space. And then on the third level, there's a Mithraeum, which is 1st century CE, and it was a sanctuary to the god Mithras, for the cult of Mithras. And it was for males, and it had a kind of hierarchical structure that was similar to the ranks of the military. And so this was a place where there was, as far as we know, and we know not so much about the Mithraic, what happened in these sacred spaces, but there was a banquet. And so presumably people would sit on these benches, and here is a shrine in the center to Mithras, who is always depicted killing in the act of killing a bull, the tauroctony. And there's correspondences with Mithra and Zoroastrianism and Persian traditions, and the Romans here are really appropriating this story and kind of concretizing it into this image. And this hat and this cloak that he's wearing are very much codes for Roman definitions of what Persian looks like, or Eastern. So it's this kind of Orientalism that the Romans applied to characters like Mithras. But in this space, there was this meal, and one of the scholars, Bridget Keslinki at the American Academy of Rome, actually studies the meals that these people ate together, and as far as we can reconstruct them. And her research is very, very interesting. And so and alongside this Mithraeum, there are some Roman houses that you can kind of walk into. They have these tunnels. And so it was a residential area. It was also apparently a treasury, and then it had this Mithraeum. So it's very different experiences of the same space, and there's an underground spring there, and the water is just rushing very quickly. All the walls are made of tufa, which is a very porous rock, so the acoustics get really swallowed, and it feels like you're just kind of in this moist, kind of porous underground space. And the tufa was a very popular building material in this region. So that is one of the places that really, I went there 3 times. It really stood out to me as, a place of going down and coming up. And the experience of the 12th century basilica really changes, once you've been down in this cold, dark place. And then you're up and it's like, wow, this is the brilliance of this place is it's like you see it afresh and you get to kind of see the mosaics differently and the layout of the space differently and the monumentality of it in a different way. I'm going to show you one more place before I talk about the research piece. One more place of catabasis and anabasis, and that is a place that resides just outside of Rome, not too far outside of Rome, in Tuscia, which is Etruscan country. Imagine, there's these kind of mesas almost. There's like these flat mountains with flat tops, and down the sides are these really steep cliffs, and the wind just kind of whoosh, kind of goes from one to the other, and it's always windy there, and especially if you're out on one of these outcrops. It's very, very, it's cold wind in the winter, hot in the summer. And there's all these Etruscan tombs that kind of line the sides of the cliffs. And it's and a lot of tufa, a lot of that porous rock as well. And so there's a place called the Sacro Bosco there, the sacred wood, or the Parco dei Mostri, as some of the locals call it, the Park of Monsters. And it's in Bomarzo near Viterbo. And as you can see, there's all these stone effigies. So what is the situation there? And I think, I'll demonstrate for you how I find it to be definitely a depth psychological space of really going down intentionally, with the intention of being transformed or even integrated psychologically in certain ways, in terms of the history of the place and the function of the particular images. So it was built by Pier Francesco Orsini, starting in 1552. So it was completed in the 16th century. And according to historian Antonio Rocca, who we were very fortunate to have give us a tour of the place. It was fantastic to hear from him. The design of the park was inspired by this book by Giulio Camillo, and it was published after his death, and it was called L'Idea del Teatro. And that work is very heavily inspired by alchemical and, a kind of alchemical processes and metaphysics, as I'll describe in a little bit. And so the journey through the park, it has an entrance and it has different stages of encounters with mythic entities, and it has a place of emergence. And once you emerge, you're at the top, so you can see everywhere you've been. And it's really intended, it seems to be intended to be this hermetic journey of transformation and understanding of, the process of creation, transformation of consciousness and matter. So that's that's a tall order. So how does this actually work? Well, it's, encapsulated in specific images. We can kind of piece together the story that Rocca is actually reconstructing through his research about the connection between Orsini and Camillo. So the Sphinx is the first character we meet in this Sacro Bosco, and she says, "You who enter here, reflect carefully and then tell me if all these wonders you're about to see are made for trickery or art." So we've got this sort of riddle challenge, or maybe they're made for something else. So the Sphinx is very important, according to Rocca, and there's actually another Sphinx, that's not the only one. And because he says, in closing the access route, or at least closing it kind of in your way, getting in your way as you're walking forward, it seemed to announce this pair of sphinxes as the epiphany of another world. You're about to enter another world. We have now, as Rocca points out, a primary analogy with l'idea. Camillo's text opens, in fact, with a preface where he recommends that the scholar conceal the through the use of symbols, or kind of guide the truth through the use of symbols. And he's referring to this passage in Camilo that goes like this: Mercury Trismegistus. So we have this hermetic alchemical character to begin with, this character who's a guide, trying to guide us throughout chemical processes of transformation. Material and psychological. Mercury Trismegistus says that religious speech infused with God's influence is violated in the presence of a vulgar crowd. So it is not without reason that the ancients, on the gates of any temple, made either a painted or sculpted sphinx, an image they used to demonstrate that one can only speak publicly about the things of God through enigma or through symbol. So there's this sense of like intentionality of I'm about to enter this other world and engage with the divine in a way that is really ineffable, and I can only really communicate through symbols or understand through symbols. So what are some more of these symbols? We have the teatro, which has 7 windows, and there should be 7 stairs as well, or 7 niches and 7 stairs. And those 7 are meant to represent the 7 levels of creation that Camilo talks about in his book. And this is something I have to learn much more about, and Antonio Roca knows, the ins and outs of all these symbols and how they map onto Camilo's book. But this is one that really struck me because, as Antonio explained during our tour, this isn't really like a working theater. And it's also in his book, he says this: it's not really a theater. Like, how does this function as a theater? Like, where do people perform on this, or do they sit and in the audience here? You can't really sit on the stairs, but where's the audience? If this is the theater, where's the audience? There isn't really an audience place because this is kind of higher up from where you're kind of looking from below. And so it's meant to be in essence, a symbol for understanding the steps of creation and of understanding kind of the way that matter has formed out of the immaterial. So if we're understanding this, if we're kind of like seeing this in symbol, we can understand the origins of our own consciousness and the kind of differentiated points of our own consciousness. So it's very cerebral and conceptual, but it's a symbol that's meant to elucidate some of these realizations. And there's also more concrete mythical characters, not so abstract, that are here to kind of say something about the local, in this case, the local lore. This is Heracles defeating Cacus. Heracles was in exile, as the story goes, or Hercules in the Roman tradition. So he's in exile. He comes to this area around the Tiber Valley, and he kills this indigenous inhabitant, Cacus. So, Virgil uses it in his Aeneid, Book 8, as a kind of story that Aeneas is told about defeating the enemy as the invader. And there's also something that one could say about the experience of exile, but then also, when does exile become invader? That's a huge theme in the Aeneid, that I read at least. And another image we see is Aphrodite. And this kind of, this image of Aphrodite is seen to be, kind of unfortunate, like a little sad. There's also a little dog peeking out on top of her. And I don't know what the dog is about. But what I read is, he has this kind of conflicted relationship, this is Orsini, with his wife, because he had to marry into the Farnese family when he was working on this. And he had a lover who died shortly around the same period as his marriage. And he was mourning the lover. And so the question of, does this represent his wife? Does it represent the lover? That remains to be seen. So it doesn't, in a sense, some of this material is personal to Orsini. Some of it we can be free to, contemplate for ourselves. Finally, we go to the door of hell, or door to hell, this monstrous figure, which says every thought flies. And there's different thoughts about like, why is this the inscription? Does it refer to when you go inside and there's a little table in the center and anything you say gets really amplified and kind of flies out of the door? I don't know, but this is the kind of last boss you meet, as it were, before you go up and you return to the ordinary world, and you can see everything below. So it's a very interesting place. So the last section of this talk that I'll present to you before we go to Q&A is speaking of goings down and comings up. I feel like research can have that kind of function for some of us. It's like we're going into this sort of shamanic place and we're visiting the archives or visiting the texts, and we have to come with some sort of insight. And wow, how do we interpret these things? So I have a couple of examples of things that have really inspired me in my journey, and synchronicities that have happened while I've been in Italy, and actually using that as a place to go to Zurich, conveniently located, so I can do some research in the Jung house. And I wanted to just present a couple of things that I found that might be interesting to us if we're talking about myth stuff, psychology, what lives in this part of the world that I've encountered. So this is the interior of ETH Zurich, which is a place that has a very robust Jungian archive, and that's where I was able to come across some of Jung's letters and writings. So speaking of Jung, I wanted to start and just talk about a little bit about the research I did at the archives in his library. So the Jung House has been a museum that the family has run since 2018, and some of the family members still live there, so they only have certain days when you can visit. But they're very, open to people coming and doing archival research, very, very helpful. And they have connections at the university who can help you find what you need for your purposes. And it's a very interesting place, it's kind of embodies the phrase "called or uncalled, God will arrive," that's inscribed in Latin in front of the door or just over the door of the house. That's also in every one of Jung's books. So it was a phrase that really guided him as a researcher of all sorts of things in preparation for his writings and his work with patients. One of the most interesting elements for me is his engagement with Orphism, or a tradition of Greek and Roman mythology that's kind of related to underworld journeying. It's like, how do we prepare for that descent? And there's this whole Orphic mythology that has a kind of cosmological or emphasis on how the world came into being that matches or encourages the process of, contemplating how one navigates the afterlife. And there's different Orphic gods that show up a lot in Jung's writings. And so just one example is this character that I'm very interested in. He's called Abraxas. And he lives at the bottom of this mandala that Jung started to draw back when he was having his active imagination journeys, when he was having these encounters with his unconscious and figures therein. He drew a kind of rudimentary form of this map, essentially, of psyche in some ways, to put it very, very reductively. And at the top, we have this Orphic god Phanes, who's this child being born from an egg. And Phanes is this like light being of light. And as far as I can tell from Jung's writings, this was associated very much with like the celestial part of our psyche. It's like the self that's integrated and has this kind of more celestial or spiritual outlook, whereas Abraxas is down here. He's kind of like a caterpillar or a worm, and he is the instinct. He's like, if we think about the Dionysian and the Apollonian, like the kind of Dionysus figure of, instinct, the lower world, the processes of the human that have these underlying motivations that are more complicated and maybe even fragmented. And this idea of Abraxas it inspired me. And I also noticed that Jung has a whole book on Abraxas, and it was very heavily annotated, more than a lot of the books that he had. And what was very interesting is I was reading his letters, and this is something that just came to my mind. Should have put in the slides. But he had one correspondent who wrote to him and said, "What do you know about Abraxas? I'm interested in, alchemy. I'm interested in Orphism. I'm interested in these kinds of, beings and how you're using them." And Aniela Jaffe, his secretary at the time, Jung's secretary wrote back and said, "I'm pretty sure he doesn't really write on Abraxas, but he has this whole book and it's so heavily annotated." I'm just very interested in, what this character means for us understanding Jung's engagement with the Orphic tradition and how Jung might have understood it. So I will stay tuned on more of that. And oops, I just escaped my slides. I'm going to go back. And I got too excited there. So here we have Orpheus and the Sirens. This is one of my favorite sets of sculptures. It used to be in the Getty Villa, and now it's been repatriated to Taranto, where it's from. But, when we visited the cave, the Grotte di Castellana in Puglia in our first slide, it's from a similar region, I would say. It's around there. Looking at Giancarlo, it's not in the same place, but it's around there. And they have a long history of Orphic sensibilities in that area, Orphic and Pythagorean, which was also a topic of that Carl Karenyi, Jung's close collaborator, really dove into. So there's something about this region that I am interested in connecting with the Orphic emphases in general, but also possibly in Jung, just keeping that in mind. So from Kusnacht, where Jung's house is, we go to Zurich, where I actually got to spend some time with some of Jung's writings on active imagination, or the processes of kind of engaging with the unconscious, a kind of underworld journeying that I'm kind of likening to the Orphic afterlife journey. So I'm looking at active imagination as he models it in his Red Book through dialogue, in relationship to some of the texts we have from the Orphic tradition that have dialogues in them that involve the deceased going into the underworld and really navigating that space with the help of local figures in that zone, as Jung does in his active imagination. So I'm also in the process of looking at some of these notes, which is very exciting, and, just really grateful for the opportunity to see how he was moving from defining active imagination to practice. He has a lot of notes on the practice. He has some sample dreams of his own that people can work with and use those images for their own kind of navigation of the symbolism and where they might like to inquire further. There's also some correspondence from people close to Jung, such as James Hillman. I got to see some of the letters between them, such as when Hillman was an associate editor for this journal called Envoy when he was in Ireland. And this is essentially probably one of the first letters he writes to Jung about James Joyce and some of his ideas about Joyce, which is very exciting to read. So, there's some pieces and threads of this Orphism and Jung project that I would like to explore further, and I plan to. The other strand of synchronicity and research that I discovered when I was in Italy, and this is what I'll end with, is the story it stems from an experience, a trip that we took with the American Academy of Rome to Ravenna. And so this is in northern Italy, and it's a place where there's all these 5th century mosaics. A lot of them were commissioned by Theodoric the Great, who was this great Goth ruler of the area. And he was trying to balance these two systems of Christianity that coexisted there. And so he gave them both like almost identical sanctuaries with almost identical mosaics so that they wouldn't fight each other. And so everyone would have their place of worship. And these mosaics are beautiful. They sing to you as you look at them. They're often beatific, like here, we have this image of these deer, um, and all of these vines and this kind of meander that has very ancient origins as a pattern. We have saints, we have images of kind of abstract images. These are beautiful pieces. And when I was in a bookstore in Ravenna, I happened across this book, James Hillman and Silvia Ronchi, L'ultima immagine. And I was like, what are they doing in Ravenna? And I've been studying Italian, and it's written in Italian. And it's a set of dialogues. I find that it's a set of dialogues between James Hillman and Silvia Ronchi, who is a Byzantinist. She works at the University of Roma Tre. And they had this correspondence for a long time. And they actually met up and looked at some of these mosaics together and talked about their depth psychological and mythical significance in 2008. And then a few years later, when Hillman is dying, they realize that they have not finished their work. They haven't finished this dialogue and published this book, and they still really want to. So he calls her to him, when he's just about a month away from death, according to the foreword by Margot McLean. And so Sylvia comes, and they have these dialogues there, sometimes about Ravenna, sometimes about just life, death, what's happening, transition. And so Sylvia's published this in 2021, and these dialogues kind of are interwoven throughout the book. And there's some nice plates of some of these mosaics. And so I've been looking through this book and reading it, and it doesn't exist in English, it's only in Italian, although the dialogues themselves were in English. And so I've been just so overjoyed to be able to connect with James Hillman's thoughts here, some of his final thoughts, and actually reach out to Sylvia and have conversations with her about this, which I had the chance to and the privilege to when I was there. So there's a couple of moments I just wanted to share with you from this book before we wrap up. There's a lot of mosaics that they're just talking about, and this is one that I really find very funny in a sense. Like, they're talking about, wow, these motifs and some of these mosaics, these rosettes, are so fascinating. And the way that the eye moves from the border to the colors, it just creates this dizzying effect that can be a kind of drug-induced engagement with images that can be so powerful. Because the final image, it really is about how we engage with images, this whole book. And in this case, the images in these mosaics, the pair decides at some point they're image drugged. It's like they're drogati, they're like too much. And Hillman says, we've had our dose, let's go sit and reflect. It's too much, we've been through this. And she talks about this, how there's these abstract images, as Sylvia mentions, which activate interior vision, like the starry sky above us. She's referring to this starscape that's at the top of this mausoleum of Gallia Placidia that was 5th century. And these mosaics look brand new when you see them, even though they're 5th century CE. It's like they're so new to our eye. And this is all spirals. These stars are in spirals. So they create a kind of sort of dimensionality about them that, I was moved to tears when I saw them. The second piece, sometimes they have different takes, these two, in their conversations. Like, Sylvia will sometimes be more historical because she is a historian, so she has this history of the women who funded some of these mosaics. And she's like, no wonder they're in powerful positions in the mosaics themselves. They funded them. And then he says, well, they have so much interiority, psychological interiority as well. And you can tell. We've seen Theodora, the empress, in this mosaic down to the right. We've seen the mausoleum Galla Placidia, to whom the mosaics we just saw were dedicated. But when we talk about the power of the feminine, we have to be mindful. This is the type of woman who is aware of what she carries within her, someone who has a particular type of connection to her interiority. So it's interesting to see the complementarity of their ideas. And the final piece that I'll leave you with is the question that really provokes both of them to write this book together. What is an image? In our conversations about Ravenna, we proposed that the ancient mind was capable of reading what you called the figure, la figura, from external appearances, was capable of understanding through the sensory image the interior image. So there's like that layering that we were talking about at the beginning of like what's outside and what's inside. In Ravenna, you said, if we understand what an image is, we can liberate ourselves from what the image we believe images to be. And Hillman says, yes, very much so. If for once we could understand what an image is, we would no longer be slaves to the non-verisimilitude or the kind of unreliability of false images which can take us over. So I brought you through many, many images that have sort of mythical significance and invite us all to kind of undergo these transformations together. And, you know, my own thoughts about where I'd like to go in my own engagement with images, rather, whether they be the Orphic ones in Jung, or spending some more time with this book and just appreciating the set of dialogues these two had together. Or maybe if I go back, going to the Basilica di San Clemente again and enjoying the Mithraeum to Basilica experience. So I know I went over and beyond where I wanted to go time-wise, but I appreciate everyone for listening, and if you'd like to stick around and ask some questions, you're very welcome to. So thank you very much for your attention.